The sharp bark shattered the silence of the hospice wing. It was sudden, loud and unrelenting, snapping the heads of nurses, visitors and patients alike. The German Shepherd was stiff, alert, teeth bared. He wasn't growling out of fear. This was different. This was protection, and he was facing a nurse. Ethan Cole, the blind veteran in room 14B, was still seated quietly on the side of his bed, unaware of the chaos his dog had just caused. He reached out instinctively and touched the side of Shadow's neck. The dog didn't move, he just kept barking at the young nurse standing frozen near the medicine cart. "Shadow," Ethan whispered, confused. "What is it, boy?" But the barking wouldn't stop. Shadow was trained, military trained, combat grade, obedient, and gentle. He had served 2 tours alongside Ethan in Afghanistan before Ethan lost his vision to a roadside bomb. Since then, Shadow had been his eyes and his only family. Nurse Miranda flinched when Shadow stepped forward. I wasn't doing anything," she stammered, backing away slowly. Her voice trembled just enough for the head nurse, Ms. Leary, to notice. "Get security," Leary whispered to the orderly. "Now." But by the time the guards arrived, Miranda had already slipped out the exit door. And Shadow had stopped barking. What the staff didn't know yet, what the security camera above the hallway would later reveal, was that Shadow had reacted not just to instinct. He had smelled something very wrong. Ethan sat quietly. After Shadow settled back down beside him, his calloused fingers rested on the dog's head, rubbing in small circles, though his face remained stoic. But his thoughts were anything but calm. He had learned to read Shadow's signals better than he could ever read a person's face. That bark, it wasn't for show. Shadow had sensed danger. Later that evening, Ms. Leary entered Ethan's room with hesitation. "Mr. Cole, about earlier today—" "She didn't belong here," Ethan said flatly. His pale eyes looked in the direction of her voice, though they saw nothing. "He doesn't bark unless he's sure." "I know," she replied. "We're looking into it." There was silence for a moment. Then Ethan asked, "What was she doing when he barked?" "She was preparing your medication." Ethan didn't say anything after that. His hand froze on Shadow's fur. He already knew. The next day was quiet, almost too quiet. Nurse Miranda didn't return, but her absence didn't ease Ethan's nerves. Something deeper had been stirred, something he hadn't let rise to the surface in years. Shadow's bark had pulled it out, like a hand reaching into cold water and dragging up an old, rusted memory. Ethan had learned not to trust the world after the explosion. He'd also learned that darkness had more to do with what people hid inside than the absence of light. In the battlefield, you saw it in the faces of those pretending to be your allies. Here it hid behind plastic name tags and forced smiles. Shadow wouldn't forget her scent. That much he knew. Meanwhile, the security team reviewed the footage. Grainy but clear enough, the camera caught Miranda pulling something from her pocket. As she stood by Ethan's IV, the needle in her hand wasn't part of the standard procedure. Before she could use it, Shadow had jumped up and barked, causing her to drop it and flee. The footage was immediately handed over to the administrator. The police were called, and suddenly Ethan's instincts were vindicated. But there was more to it. Miranda wasn't a registered nurse. Her ID was fake. Her background check came up blank. She had slipped into the facility with forged documents just 2 weeks prior and had been assigned to veterans with critical care needs. Ethan's case had stood out, not because he was vulnerable, but because someone was looking for him. That night, Shadow wouldn't settle. He paced near the door. Every creak in the hallway made him growl. Ethan didn't sleep much either. There was a familiar itch crawling back under his skin, the same he'd felt during night watches overseas. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. Ethan spoke softly into the dark. "You felt something I couldn't see, didn't you, boy?" Shadow's ears perked. He came over and rested his head on Ethan's knee. "We've been through worse," Ethan muttered. "But this time we're alone." There was a long pause. Then Ethan added, "Unless she wasn't acting alone." By morning, more details had emerged. The woman calling herself Miranda was linked to another suspicious case at a nearby facility. Another veteran had died of an overdose last month. The death had been labeled accidental, But now things looked different. Shadow had prevented something terrible from happening. But the question remained. Why Ethan? Why now? And most of all, who sent her? Back in his room, Ethan sat in silence as two detectives asked him questions. He answered what he could. He mentioned no known enemies, no recent threats. But something inside him began to shift. A memory, old and blurred at the edges, started to resurface. During our last deployment, he said slowly, we intercepted a convoy that wasn't supposed to exist. Shadow was there. He found the buried munitions, illegal ones. We reported. It followed protocol, but we were told to shut up. Then I got reassigned. A week later, my vehicle hit an IED. The detectives exchanged glances. You think someone wanted to silence you back then? One of them asked. Ethan shrugged. I don't know. But Shadow was the only one who stayed. They looked down at the dog, sitting calmly by the bed, his eyes sharp and fixed on them. Ethan added, and he just barked at a ghost who didn't exist. That can't be coincidence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the camera outside Ethan's room blinked red. It was recording. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. Shadow's ears twitched, and then footsteps, not rushed, not loud, calm, deliberate. A figure in scrubs walked slowly down the hallway, clipboard in hand, face down, head covered, identical uniform to the rest, but Shadow was already on his feet. He walked to the door and growled. Ethan sat up straight. What is it? The door creaked. Shadow lunged forward with a snarl, his paws hitting the door just as the figure reached for the knob. Outside, the hallway camera zoomed in, and what it captured would send shivers down the spine of everyone who watched it the next morning. The figure outside the door didn't flinch when Shadow hit it, but they also didn't enter. Instead, the person slowly backed away, head still lowered, before turning and walking down the hallway, disappearing beyond the frame of the camera. Inside the room, Ethan could feel Shadow's pulse through the leash wrapped around his hand. It was racing. He's back, isn't he? Ethan whispered. Shadow didn't bark this time, but his body remained stiff, like he was waiting for something to happen. Ethan clenched his fists. His mind raced back to Kandahar, back to the half-buried. Crate Shadow had sniffed out behind the civilian convoy. The serial numbers had been scratched off. That wasn't normal. Neither was the urgency with which his superior officer had told him to forget what he saw. A week later, the explosion blinded him, and everything went silent after that. Until now, someone had waited all these years, watched from the shadows, and now they were trying to finish the job. The next morning, Detective Lang returned to the hospice. There was no name badge on the person last night, she told Ethan. No one on the schedule matches their description. Whoever it was, they came with a purpose. Ethan didn't respond. He just rubbed the back of Shadow's neck. We pulled enhanced stills from the camera, Lang continued, and you might want to hear this. That wasn't the same person as before. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Then who was it? Lang hesitated. We're still checking facial recognition, but whoever they are, they wore the same uniform, same shoes, same clipboard. It was coordinated. Ethan leaned back slowly. A network. This wasn't a random attack. It was part of something organized, and he was the loose thread. That evening, Ethan requested to be moved to another room, one without cameras. The staff hesitated, but he insisted. Sometimes the only way to catch a ghost, Ethan said, is to let them think you're blind in every sense of the word. They agreed. But Ethan wasn't alone. Shadow remained alert, every muscle trained for the unexpected. He didn't relax, not even when Ethan rested his hand on his head. Ethan whispered, "If they come, you'll know." It was 3:13 a.m. when it happened. The faintest sound, not footsteps, not voices, a shift in the air. Shadow stood. The door opened, slow, careful. Someone stepped inside, dressed like maintenance. Tool belt, gloves, face partly covered. They crept closer, toward the IV drip. Shadow waited until the figure reached the bed. Then he exploded. The growl turned into a full-blown attack, as Shadow lunged at the man's arm, clamping down before he could insert the needle into the line. The man screamed, more in shock than pain, twisting violently as Shadow dragged him to the floor. Ethan hit the emergency alarm button. By the time the guards arrived, Shadow had cornered the man near the sink, his teeth still bared, front paws planted like stone. The intruder's bag was filled with medical tools, syringes, and vials, but there was no ID, and again, no trace of who sent him. Hours later, Ethan sat with Detective Lang and a federal agent named Ruiz. "Your dog saved your life." "Again," Ruiz said. Ethan nodded. "He always does." "We're beginning to believe this isn't about you alone," Lang added. "There's a chance this is connected to a larger cover-up." Ruiz pulled out a folder. "Do you remember the name Lieutenant Colonel Martin Hayes?" Ethan froze. That name hadn't crossed his mind in nearly a decade. "He's missing," Ruiz continued. "Went off the grid 6 months ago. Last seen in Europe. He was the one who signed off on your mission report back in '09. Ethan felt the weight of 1,000 buried memories rise inside him. The look on Hayes's face after the munitions report, the silence after the explosion, the way every attempt Ethan made to report what happened was met with deflection. Now Hayes was gone, and someone was tying up loose ends. "Why now?" Ethan asked. Ruiz looked directly at him. "Because the war's secrets are coming home." Back. In his room, Ethan sat quietly. Shadow rested near the bed, eyes open, still alert. Ethan spoke softly. "They won't stop." He reached into the drawer, pulled out a box and opened it. Inside was a coin, military issue engraved with coordinates. A coin Shadow had sniffed out from the rubble after the blast. Ethan held it tightly. "But neither will we." Later that day, a tech team installed high-level surveillance around Ethan's new room, not just cameras, infrared sensors, motion detectors, and thermal imaging. Shadow watched every move. Ruiz had put Ethan under temporary federal protection. But Ethan knew protection didn't mean safety. Not really. Not when the threat came from people trained just like him. But there was one thing they didn't count on. Shadow. 2 days passed with no incidents, no strange visitors, no attempted intrusions, but on the third night something changed. At 2:47 a.m. Shadow began to whimper, not in fear, but in pain. Ethan sat up immediately. "Shadow?" The dog stumbled as he tried to stand. His legs shook. He collapsed by the bathroom door. "Shadow!" Ethan felt his body grow cold. He called the nurse. Within minutes, the emergency vet was called in, blood pressure crashing, breathing shallow. A toxin was found in Shadow's system. Someone had gotten to him. But how? The security footage showed no one entering the room. Then Ruiz found something. The evening janitor had placed a bowl of water in the room for Shadow earlier that day. The janitor wasn't on the staff list. He had vanished. Shadow survived. Barely. The poison had been fast-acting, designed for animals. Not a kill dose, but enough to incapacitate, enough to remove Ethan's eyes. Ethan sat by Shadow's side for hours after the vet stabilized him. His hand never left the dog's fur. "They wanted to blind me again," he whispered. But he wasn't angry, he was calm, too calm, because now it was war. In the background, the federal team worked faster. Hayes's name kept appearing, connected to several quiet investigations, each one abruptly shut down, each involving smuggled weapons, falsified records, and missing soldiers. Someone had decided Ethan was a threat, and now they had made one mistake too many. They had hurt Shadow. At midnight, Ethan got dressed for the first time in weeks. He put on his old boots, his military jacket, and he placed Shadow's service vest gently back on his body. "You ready?" he asked. Shadow, still weak, lifted his head. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan smiled grimly. "Then let's finish what they started." The federal van moved in silence as it rolled down the dark service road, tires humming low on old asphalt. Ethan sat in the back, Shadow curled beside his feet, his breathing heavier than usual. The antidote had helped, but the poison had left its mark. Still, Shadow insisted on staying by Ethan's side. Ruiz sat across from them, flipping through a tablet screen. "We traced the last fake nurse to an abandoned VA records depot, 20 miles outside the city, he said. No cameras, no staff, just old paper file, and too many things someone doesn't want found. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we find them. Ruiz nodded. We've got backup en route, but we go in first, quietly. Just the three of us. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's back. 4. The depot was dead quiet. No alarms. No buzz. Of lights. Just shadows layered thick across rows of dusty steel cabinets. Ruiz took point, sweeping each corridor with a flashlight. Ethan followed closely, hand on Shadow's harness, feeling every vibration, every subtle change in the air. Halfway down the third row, Shadow stopped, his body tensed, head low. A soft growl vibrated in his throat. Ethan whispered, "He smells something." Ruiz raised his weapon. Shadow veered left, pulling Ethan toward a small office tucked behind a half-closed sliding door. The air changed, damp, chemical, unnatural. Inside, rows of sealed crates sat under a flickering bulb, and next to them, an open laptop, still running. Ruiz moved fast, snapping photos and yanking out the hard drive. Ethan stepped closer to the crates. His hand traced a number stenciled in black paint, KX3147. He froze. That number was on the manifest, the one he'd reported, the one they said never existed. Shadow barked sharply. From behind them, footsteps, quick, precise. Ethan turned, just as a man stepped into the doorway, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with military discipline. He didn't hesitate. He aimed. Shadow lunged before the shot could fire. A scream tore through the air as the man crashed against the desk, Shadow's teeth locking onto his forearm. Ruiz was already on him, gun pressed to his temple. "Don't move." The man didn't resist. Ethan stepped forward slowly. The intruder's face, bruised, aged, but unmistakable. Iltine Cole Martin Hayes. They interrogated Hayes in the depot office while waiting for backup. The truth spilled out faster than expected. "Yes," Hayes admitted. "Those crates were never supposed to exist. That convoy was carrying illegal arms, unregistered, untraceable." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You buried the report." "I was ordered to," Hayes said, eyes hollow. "And when the explosion happened, they told me to let you die with the lie." "And the others?" Ethan asked. "The fake nurses? The poison?" "Clean up," Hayes muttered. "Orders from the top." "Someone didn't like you asking questions," Ethan took a long breath. Shadow leaned against his leg, steady now, his strength returning. Ruiz radioed in the coordinates. Within minutes, agents arrived. Hayes was taken into custody. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just about Hayes, it never was. Weeks later, Ethan stood before a closed congressional hearing. He told everything, about the manifest, about the explosion, about the silence that followed. Shadow sat beside him the whole time, silent, noble, alert, his scars visible now, a badge of survival. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but someone leaked footage later. Footage of the moment when, mid-testimony, Ethan reached down and touched the dog's head and whispered, "We made it." The clip went viral, not because of the hearing, but because of the way Shadow leaned into Ethan's leg and let out a breath, like he knew it was finally safe to sleep. The hospice received hundreds of letters, some from other veterans, some from strangers, but one stood out. A child's handwriting, barely legible. It said, "Dear Mr. Ethan, my dad says, you are a hero. I think your dog is one too. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you, but I want a dog first. Love, Sam, age 8. Ethan smiled for the first time in a long while. He folded the letter carefully and slid it into his pocket. Months later, Ethan moved to a quiet home on the edge of a pine forest. The hospice visits were done. The hearings had ended. The government had issued him a formal apology. He didn't care. All he needed was Shadow and the silence between them. One afternoon, while walking along a dirt path behind the house, Shadow stopped. He lifted his head, ears twitching. "Then?" he barked, just once, loud, sharp, alert. Ethan froze. "What is it, boy?" Then he heard it too. A car. slowing on the road nearby. It wasn't the sound that froze him. It was the voice from the open window, a woman calling out, "Nurse Mallory, I—" "Found him, that's the dog." Ethan turned, the car door opened, and from the back seat a camera crew stepped out. Ethan didn't move. Shadow growled softly. And at that exact moment, the camera captured the most unexpected thing. The nurse from the hospice, the very first one Shadow had barked at, stepping toward them, not with a needle, but with a plaque, and a tear in her eye. She knelt beside Shadow, placed the plaque in front of him, and whispered, "For the dog who saw what no one else could." The camera flashed. Shadow didn't bark. He just looked up at Ethan. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan saw something. Not with his eyes, but with everything else. Peace.